If you're new here, welcome. If you've seen my other stuff, welcome back. Pause for a second. What do you reckon the role of government should be? Some people reckon the government's responsibility is to fix every single issue they're experiencing. And other people believe the government should stay as far away as possible, do as little as possible, just get out of the way. Most of us are going to sit somewhere in the middle. I personally believe that the government has the responsibility to ensure that the systems that keep this country sustainable and prosperous keep working, and if there's an opportunity to improve those systems, then they need to take it and do it well. The role of a government is to make sure the train stays on the tracks. They're meant to act like the bumper on a bowling alley or a net at the bottom of a fall. Anything else they can do to make our lives better is awesome. That's a win. But at their core, in my opinion, the government's role is to make sure that systems are working and as few people are falling through the cracks. I don't think that's too narrow an expectation. I'm not talking about the bare minimum here. It's difficult to make sure systems still keep working and make sure that no one falls through the cracks as things change. As more people require trains, those trains have to be better and faster. The rails need to be adjusted. You've got to make sure that more people can afford to use this incredible service. That's not an easy task. If someone is consistently bowling so fast that they're smashing through the bumpers, you gotta change what those bumpers are made of and how they work to ensure that being in the gutter is not someone's norm. If people are consistently falling off that drop, you gotta make sure that that net is big and strong enough to catch them, and you need to consider whether or not you need to put in a rail or two. We're not saying that the government's job is to simply make sure the status quo works. We're not letting them get off easy. But we also have to be realistic about what we should and shouldn't expect the government to do. They're responsible for making sure the systems that keep Aussies protected are working. But sometimes a widening gap is not the fault of the government, and they can't necessarily immediately do anything to fix that gap. And that's important to recognize, because if we believe that the government should be able to fix everything and anything, well, that's when snake oil salesmen get to rob us blind. This video wasn't initially going to be about the current fuel crisis, but that's kind of perfect example we can talk about here, where the government's got its hand tied behind its back, and people are still expecting them to do something about it. Let's set out the facts. We're in this mess because Epstein's homeboy and God's supposed chosen but most amoral warrior went to war with Iran, seemingly without thinking or caring how it was going to affect anyone else. Somehow the US and Israel seem to have forgotten or did not care that Iran was in control of the Strait of Hormuz. That's a shipping lane that roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through. Most people with a basic understanding of this fact knew that the second you went to war with Iran, they were going to use their control over the Strait of Hormuz to put economic and political pressure on the United States and Israel in an effort to really get them to f*** off. The reason we're copping it is Australia gets most of its fuel from places like Singapore or South Korea. They refine the fuel that we import. The issue is those nations are heavily reliant on the oil that comes from the Strait of Hormuz. See the issue? The oil can't get through the Strait of Hormuz. The unrefined oil can't get to our Asian neighbors to refine. We've got nothing to import. We got no fuel. In hindsight, Australia closing its own refineries because they weren't viable in this international market. You had these mega refineries in Asia and the Middle East that we could just not compete against, put us in a dangerous position where we were incredibly reliant on importing our energy. If we had domestic refiners, we'd be in a better spot right now. But let's also not pretend that generations of Australians haven't benefited from cheaper fuel that came from globalization and importing our fuel. It made sense that Australia made the decisions it did. It's globalization 101. It's going to be cheaper to import particular things. But then obviously, if something happens to supply lines, you're going to be in a pretty difficult position. A strong argument can be made that we should have ensured we still had the capacity to produce fuel domestically. But in my opinion, there's an even stronger argument we'll get into later that we shouldn't have wasted the opportunities to push for greater renewable energy, which would have prevented this mess from happening in the first place. Unfortunately, time only moves in one direction. We can't change the past. So the real question is, what can the Australian government do to prevent this from happening in the future or to resolve the issue we're in now? Were we actually prepared for this fuel crisis? And unfortunately, the answer is never as simple as people actually want it to be. When this first started, we had about 36 days of petrol, 32 days of diesel, and 29 days of jet fuel. And all of that was fine. It was in line with our minimal stockholding obligations. That's the minimum amount of fuel we're meant to have in this country. Now, as Australia is part of the International Energy Agency, people think we're meant to actually have 90 days worth of fuel, but that isn't actually true. We're meant to have 90 days worth of imports of fuel, but that isn't actually for domestic use. That is meant to be stored in case we have to sell it back into the global market if there is a fuel crisis. The reason we haven't met those requirements, and that was across both Liberal and Labor governments, is that would have cost us about $20 billion over 4 years. And again, this is fuel that we can't use. It's effectively $20 billion that we can't use on anything. It's just to meet an obligation that won't actually help us domestically if a fuel crisis was to occur. Now, we're the only nation part of the IEA that has not met its obligation, so I guess you could make an argument that it made sense to hoard some fuel and then we just wouldn't sell it back if we weren't meeting the requirements anyway. We wouldn't necessarily have to fulfill our obligations if a crisis did occur, but obviously, that's not going to make us look good as a neighbor or trade partner or member of the agency. And overall, it's only a temporary fix, but I digress. I think it is a major issue that we're not meeting our IEA obligations, and it would have been good if we had higher minimum stockholding obligations, but all of those would have only been temporary. And that's the key word there, temporary. Because there is only one solution, and that is for the strait to open up again. And Australia has no control over that. So now that we understand the issue, the obvious next question is what, if anything, can the government do to fix this crisis? And the reality is they can't actually do much. One obvious angle to prevent this from occurring in the future is to increase our minimum stockholding obligations. But as I've already said, that's only a temporary fix. Even if we doubled or tripled our stockholding obligations, these conflicts last months, if not years. It's a band-aid solution, it's a bumper, nothing more. We could also actually ensure we're meeting our IEA obligations, but even still, that's not actually meant to be for domestic use. And even if we ignored our obligations, didn't sell it back into an international market, it still would only be a temporary buffer. If we wanted to throw our climate change policy out the window, we could start mining for crude oil, then reopen or rebuild some of our oil refineries. But overall, that's going to take billions of dollars, take years to do, and it's still going to cost us more in the long run than it might actually be worth. We're still not going to be able to compete against global markets, and it's only really going to serve us in cases of international crises, which overall are relatively rare, and if we move towards renewable energy and electric vehicles, really be a waste in the long run. Labor could also cut the fuel excise for, again, temporary relief. That would be especially beneficial for truck drivers. It would help us transport goods and services to make sure that the prices of things overall don't increase. But again, that's a temporary fix, and then we have to figure out how we're going to deal with the massive hole that's going to be in the budget. Worst case scenario, they could also enact the Liquid Fuel Emergency Act. That would give them unprecedented control over our fuel supply. They could choose where and what they want to distribute the fuel to. That would help us make sure that regional areas who aren't getting the fuel they need for farming or the transport of goods and services, or certain medical facilities that rely on fuel, would actually have the resources they need. The government doesn't think we're in a position where that's necessary yet, but I'm not so sure we're far off. Things are getting pretty bad. But even still, that doesn't fix the crisis overall. Unfortunately, we're a small nation. We're an island in the middle of nowhere. We're a middle power who doesn't have that much sway. We're well respected. Countries like us, when they trade with us or they go to war with us by their side, they think we're a good country. They like us as a people. But we have zero control over the US or Iran. There is nothing we can do to open the Strait of Hormuz. We're constantly playing this game of agreeing where we can and disagreeing where we must to ensure our own survival. The fact is, we're a country at the mercy of greater powers who don't always care or think about us. This doesn't mean we don't try to impact the world. We still need to care about what's happening in this country and plan accordingly. But it also means that state, federal, or local governments can't fix everything, no matter how hard they try. And that doesn't matter if it's the Liberals, Labor, One Nation, Greens. There's just some stuff that we can't control as a nation. It's difficult though, Because as the cost of living gets worse, as mortgages increase, as people feel like the government isn't making the fuel giants pay their fair share, as people feel ignored, the line between a reasonable and unreasonable expectation starts to blur. And it all just becomes this blurred anger at people they perceive as ignoring or abandoning them. In moments like this, when people are truly struggling, they don't remember past achievements. They worry about the now and the future. And it is a moment like that that parties like One Nation or the Liberals can capitalize on people's fears. And that is extremely worrying, because the fact of the matter is, without the Labour Party being in power, this country would not have succeeded. The Labour Party is responsible for some of the greatest achievements in Australia's history. We're talking about Medicare, HECS, fee-free TAFE, the systems that would eventually become Centrelink and Workforce Australia. All of these things were Labour inventions. Without them, this country would not be as incredible as it is. This is a party that has always tried to put people first. I got a lot of flack when I said that I truly believe that Albo, Bowen, and Chalmers are trying everything they can, even if they're not necessarily getting the best solutions. But that matters, because when the Labour Party tries, we get incredible things. I'm not going to pretend that all parties trying produces the same outcome. Could Labour have done more to prevent us getting hit so hard by this fuel crisis? Sure. But I'm also not going to pretend that Labour were the people who stopped us investing significant amounts of money into renewable energy and renewable vehicles and trying to make Australia an economic power at the forefront of a renewable energy revolution. That was the Liberals. I'm not going to pretend that Labour is the party who pushed so hard against renewable vehicles. That's been One Nation. People are angry at Labour for this crisis. But really, what could they have done? We had nearly a decade of Liberal leadership, and Albo has had under half of that time to try and fix a lot of the issues that they perpetuated onto us. We've got major issues in this country when it comes to the cost of living, mortgages, immigration. Our tax system is not set up in a way for the current population pyramid. There are significant cracks appearing in the system, and something's got to change. The older and richer Aussies are continuing to get older and richer, while everyone else is really struggling. We have a K-shaped economy that is hitting us hard. Something needs to change. There are very reasonable criticisms to be put towards the government. But them being responsible for this fuel crisis, that isn't one of them. And we have to be careful about the critiques we levy, because the second we start allowing the unreasonable criticisms to hold water, that's the moment that parties like the Liberals or One Nation get to take advantage of people's desperation. But hey, like and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments. Check out the other videos. It's been real.